Following God into the wild can be scary. I mean, no one has ever said following God is safe, but the thing is, we can trust that it's good because He is good and His plan for our lives is good. And when we make a decision to move in God's direction, those acts of faith can change the course of our world. But most of us feel like we weren't cut out for something or like we don't belong somewhere. And maybe you feel like that. Maybe you feel like you've made too many mistakes, so you're probably not cut out to be a good Christian, whatever that means. I think sometimes we all feel that way, like God won't use us because we just don't have what it takes. We've messed up way too much. And that's one of the reasons I love the story of Abraham. Because when you start to really pay attention to the details, you begin to realize that Abraham wasn't perfect either. Actually, he wasn't even close to perfect. And last week, we looked at how God called Abraham to leave his country because God promised to make Abraham a great nation. Then God promised that he would have many descendants. But what made this promise seem so unrealistic was the fact that Abraham and his wife Sarah had no children. In fact, Sarah was unable to have children. Oh, and one other significant detail, Abraham and Sarah were really old. So imagine how much trust it took for Abraham to believe and follow God, even though he knew Sarah couldn't have children. Abraham completely trusted God until he didn't. After about 10 years of waiting, Abraham and Sarah decided that they didn't want to wait anymore. It seemed like God had forgotten them. It seemed like He couldn't either pull it off or what He had promised just wasn't going to happen. So they decided to take matters into their own hands. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. Where to begin, right? There are about 1 million different ways this could go wrong, and it did. Very wrong. And even though this was a pretty common practice back then, Sarah started to actually hate Hagar because watching her made her think of how capable Hagar was and how incapable she was of fulfilling this promise of God. So Sarah ended up mistreating Hagar so much that she decided to run away. And the guy in the middle of it all is the guy all of us trace our faith heritage to. Now, not what you would expect from a guy we consider the father of our faith. But the amazing thing is that God didn't cancel His promise to Abraham because of what he had done. God still used Abraham in spite of his terrible decisions. He didn't write him off. Why? Because God's character and faithfulness aren't directly tied to our behavior. Because no matter how badly we mess up, God is who He has always been, faithful, kind, and compassionate. This story highlights that God can use broken people, regardless of their past decisions. That means that we can continue to follow God into the wild with absolute confidence, fully knowing that if we mess up, God can still use us, and even use that situation and bring good out of it. The Apostle Paul, thousands of years later, said this about faith. "For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." After Abraham's disaster, God didn't back away from him, and Abraham didn't back away from God either. In fact, God confirms His promise to Abraham in Genesis 17:7. "This is the everlasting covenant. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you." Nothing we can do will change who God is. That means that Abraham could walk confidently into the wild, knowing who God was would never change, even when he messed up, created a disaster, and had to deal with the consequences. God's promise remained the same, and the same is true for us. We can walk into the wild knowing God is who He says He is, and that our faith in that will allow us to accomplish far more than we could otherwise. So take your cue from Abraham. Don't give up because you've messed up. Remember this, even when you trip up, you can trust Him to keep His promise to continue to redeem your story. And if it's true for you, it's true for everyone around you. You can't mess up enough for God to give up on you. Because of what Jesus did on the cross, all the mistakes you make along the way will one day be washed out. They will be redeemed and forgiven. And you can still be very much a part of God's story. So don't give up because you've messed up. Just keep following where God leads. And as you head to Life Group, I want you to remember who God is. God is all-powerful. God is ever-present. God is all-knowing. God is sovereign. God is absolute truth. God is righteous. God is love. God is merciful. And God never changes.